It's my very great pleasure this morning to introduce Leslie Williams, our Ben Reed Scholar for 2012. Classmates and colleagues of Benjamin H. Reed created this award to honor the memory of their distinguished friend and to create at Episcopal a program to reflect the things that mattered to him most in his professional life, public service in both foreign and domestic affairs. This award is presented to that member of the junior class who, through excellence at upper school history courses and through a well-conceived and designed project proposal, demonstrates both scholarship and a significant commitment to national or international affairs. Applications for next year's scholarship will be available after Christmas, due by the end of January. And on November 13th, we'll have an opportunity to hear from EA alum and Ben Reed lecturer Betsy Williams about her experience working in the field of non-traditional foreign service. This morning, we'll have an opportunity to hear from Leslie about a project to travel to Morioka, Japan, and participate in various community service project opportunities, all specifically as a response to the devastating effects of the 2011 tsunami and earthquake. Her work with Kinetsu, a community service organization and planner, had its roots in the immediate aftermath of that calamity, and her project grew, in her own words, from her desire to experience the aftermath of disaster and devastation and to understand what is successfully being accomplished, what still needs to be done, and the impact on the community. Leslie's approach to this subject is no surprise, rooted as it is in her ability to empathize and connect with people, often those less fortunate than herself. Leslie's sincerity and passion is palpable for aiding the victims of the tsunami in Japan and the environmental disaster that followed. Sincere, idealistic, passionate, and fair-minded, her project reflects the qualities that I most admire in its author. Please rise to greet the Ben Reed Scholar for 2012, Leslie Williams.
Thank you. Please be seated. It was the 4th of July. I was watching fireworks from my plane as we were heading to the runway. Instead of being at a barbecue, I was on my way to Japan to study the social effects of the Tohoku tsunami and earthquake. I luckily was on the connecting flight to Bangkok. There was no Caucasian in sight, and this included the flight attendants. It was kind of like one of those moments as a little kid when you see a picture and you're asked, what doesn't belong? If you were a child, you would immediately point to me. Midway through the flight, I managed to get the guy sitting behind me who spoke zero English to take a picture as we flew over Alaska. This was just the beginning of feeling like the odd one out wherever I went, attempting to quickly adapt to my surroundings and communicating with people who spoke a language so different from my own. I survived the flight and managed to get through customs and get my bags by myself in the Tokyo airport. Outside of customs, I met up with my tour guide Akira and a girl also volunteering named Allison, who was Korean. I will never forget that ride into Tokyo at 8 at night. The subway was packed, and when I stepped out, I was the only blonde, untanned skin girl around. It was my first moment where, oh my, Leslie, you're out of America and you're the minority. The next day, we woke up early, and I was eager to get out of the city and see the countryside. We had about a 4-hour bullet train to the Tohoku region. Tohoku is the northeast part of Japan. Every stop after leaving Tokyo, the cramped housing and concrete buildings became less and less as we got closer to the more rural part of Japan. I quickly fell in love with the rolling neon green hills and traditional architecture. This was how I imagined Japan. We arrived at the town of Tono, which is a very historical town filled with many ancient folklore stories. We walked from the train station to the volunteer center. I could already tell how honest and welcoming these people were. All doors were left open, and bikes were left on the streets unlocked. There was no fear of stealing. Women came out of their houses to bow to us and say hello. Even though I was walking with my guide Akira, who's Japanese, and Allison, the Korean volunteer, me walking in between them made it pretty obvious that we were outsiders. Nevertheless, everyone smiled, bowed, and was very friendly. We now arrived at the volunteer center. and I was finally relieved. The volunteer center is made out of wood and plastic walls and roofing. A plethora of shoes were outside the door, which was Japanese style to take your shoes off before entering a building. Mind you, the shoes were mostly boots covered in mud. I stepped inside. This was the real deal. Inside to the left was a very small office of people frantically talking and running around. I was then showed to the girls' room, which was down the hall. All the bags were pushed to the walls of the room. There was just a bamboo floor for us to sleep on. We had porta potties for bathrooms. We did have running water, and there were showers, but you had to pay for them. In addition to all that, there was a very strict recycling method. There were 5 different trash cans, and you had to separate all your trash, food, etc. Akira, my guide, told me if I did not separate out my trash properly, I would have a very angry Japanese man yelling at me. Akira thinks he's very funny. The next 8 days of my life consisted of mainly hard labor. I woke up every morning at 6. I dressed in my rough jeans, a long-sleeve button-up, a hat, lots of sunscreen, and my nail-resistant toed steel boots. In addition, while we worked, we were required to wear goggles, a mask on our face, and heavy-duty gloves. We were also told to beware of sharp objects, mostly nails from the original foundation of houses, but also glass and broken roofs still stuck in the ground. I pulled up clothing, furniture, walls, children's toys, plates, pictures of families, and even a 1944 World War II Medal of Honor out of the ground. We also hatched away overgrown weeds, and from there planted gardens and flowers. Now, I could describe day to day my 8 days of volunteering, but I'm not here to tell you my story. I want to instead share the story of all the people I became connected to and interviewed. My goal was to go to Japan and study the social effects of the Tohoku tsunami and earthquake by volunteering. In the first couple of days, I retrieved the broad issue that Japan is facing right now. The biggest issue in Japan for cleaning up this disaster is money. The government in office now wants to increase the consumption tax and therefore recreate villages, schools, and ports that were literally wiped away by the earthquake or the tsunami. However, people, majority of the population living in or surrounding Tokyo, are opposed. Most do not understand why they have to pay more because they do not see these villages that are gone. They forget these children who not only have lost their lives, do not even have a school anymore. So there's a political change going on, and a new party has now emerged opposing this consumption tax. In addition to the government upheaval, the housing market is in debt. No contractor wants to build where the tsunami hit, but Japan is running out of room elsewhere, and in addition, these people who have lost everything cannot afford to pay such high prices for new houses and do not want to move to a new community. Therefore, these people are still living in temporary housing a year and 4 months after the tsunami and earthquake. Mind you, temporary housing are tiny one-floor rooms clustered together. The walls are basically plastic and a little bit of metal. These are not homes. These are not places where a child should have to stay. However, the children there are the lucky ones because they still have a family. There are hundreds of children that are now orphans living in dormitories bunched together. Mind you, these temporary housing and dormitories are located at the decimated schools. This means that these children don't have a school anymore or fields to play in. The schools are now mass homes for people without a place to go. The communities that these people have been living in for their entire lives are gone, and majority of Japan is not helping because it is out of sight and out of mind. However, some Japanese people have an excuse for not knowing the real facts about this disaster because the government has been keeping some information secret. In my volunteer center, I met a man named Hamaji who is creating a documentary about this entire disaster. He explained to me how the media in Japan is not allowed to show any negative aspects of the disaster. They are not allowed to by government enforcement. He told me it is not illegal, but the government will find a way to take your information and destroy your career. The government does this because Japan is an island nation. They survive off of mass importation. If countries see them weak or see that they are having problems, the Japanese economy is immediately in jeopardy. Therefore, it can be perceived that Japan has a censorship on information in its country. It is actually a little frightening, Hamaji said to me. People are devastated from this disaster. The easiest way I can explain them to you is to compare the victims to the two different kinds of earth I worked with. There's the victim that will not stop talking, who is open and easy to communicate with. I like working with that form of earth. It is easy to plant in, and it is very fertile. Now, the other earth I worked with is impossible to penetrate. You beat at the earth with a shovel and get a spoonful of dirt instead. These are the victims that will not come out of temporary housing. They do not speak, they live in shock, and there is no money for psychological help. Hamaji told me about a boy that did not speak for 3 months after the disaster. The best gardener in our group was also a volunteer, and she ranted for 3 hours, still working fast. She described how no one could remember all the details because it was so shocking. I remember staring at this petite woman, hunched over, dirt up to her elbows, short black hair, and a confident attitude with a hint of a motherly face. Working next to her at that moment, with my hands in the dirt as well, I looked out to the ocean. I looked at the 30-foot concrete wall that was supposed to stop the ocean. I saw the metal hand railing leading up to the top of that wall, bent at 90 degrees. Can you imagine seeing a 60-foot high wave coming at you, your family, your house, your life? I then met Hiroku, one of the volunteers that had been there since April of last year, right after the disaster. Hiroku has a thin face, faint black mustache, rough skin, and a rural toothy grin. I interviewed him and I asked him to describe the scene that he saw in April of last year. He said, "I can imagine the scene, but he said I needed to understand the smell." He had trouble describing it. He said, "No one can imagine how bad something smells until you smell the stench of dead fish, dead animals, and dead bodies rotting together as one." One of my strongest memories of the trip was when we did soft work. We went to temporary housing and made food and had tea and did arts and crafts with these older women. These women were all above 70 and were all rice farmers. The woman to my left, her back was bent at 90 degrees because she spent more of her life bent over working on the rice field, so her back grew horizontally. The woman to my right did not speak too much, but for the 4 hours I was there, she held my hand. She kept squeezing every 30 seconds or so, just so I would look at her and she would be convinced I was not going to leave her. This is what I was thrown into. Yeah, I stuck out like a sore thumb. To the older generation, I reminded them of the horrors of World War II and was looked at as the enemy because of my distinct American looks. I had trouble with the language. That was easy. The hard part was pulling up baby toys, pictures, and people's things out of the ground. Imagine your house hit by a disaster and someone finding your photo album or your little sibling's clothes or your grandfather's watch that he gave you. I was pulling up strangers' most beloved things in the dirt, putting them in a pile. I cleaned out and searched through buildings that had a blood red X marked on the front, which meant dead bodies were originally found in there. I somehow managed to keep it together as one of the older women would just not let go of me and cried when all the volunteers had to leave temporary housing. And then, on top of all that, realizing that I cannot snap my fingers and change everything. It was all out of my control. I felt small and weak. Every night after volunteering, there was a brief meeting in the boys' sleeping room. We all piled in and sat on the bamboo floor. One particular meeting hit me the most. It was the day after I spent hours with the older women doing crafts and making them food, and it was also July 12th, the monthly anniversary of the earthquake and tsunami. That day in particular, I was frustrated. Flashbacks of the women took over my mind, and all I could think about was they were someone's mother or grandmother, and now they have no one. I quickly tried to get my mind off of those thoughts and refocused on our leader who was about to speak. The man had the attire and expressiveness of a Confucian monk. He dressed in a white toga, had a shaved head, and wore wooden jewelry. The man glided into the room and sat on the bamboo ground in a kneeling position, then shifted his weight to the back of his legs. Tonight's briefing was to remind us all of our purpose for volunteering. Before he began speaking, I scanned the room. I studied the faces of the volunteers. Their faces were long, gloomy, and worked. He called attention and then spoke on our level, looking into our eyes. I sadly cannot repeat every exquisite phrase he spoke, but I will try to get his message across. He himself scanned the room and said, "We are not here to rebuild homes, roads, or schools. We don't have that power. We are instead here to rekindle a community that for some has been around for generations. We are here to unite the victims and strengthen this community. We shall create gardens, flower beds, and peaceful resting places to draw out the disturbed, the sorrowed, the broken. Together as one, we can do something greater than infrastructure. We can create a relationship. Material things do not make people happy. They do not solve or aid the sick. People, speaking, minds alike, together heal." As he spoke so fluidly, his eyes were closed. You knew he meant every word that he was saying. After the meeting, we all walked outside to the front of the volunteer center to make the anniversary remembrance sign of the tsunami and earthquake. Volunteer centers have branched together and decided that in order not to forget this disaster, that on the 12th of every month, all volunteer centers will make a huge sign and candles. Of course, I was in charge of pulling up the wick of every single candle, since I was the only one that could not make Japanese symbols. Once the sign was created, different members shared personal stories and statements. We then Skyped with all the other volunteer centers, each one showing their candlelit sign to the other. This was the Japan I discovered, a culture so beautiful, so distinct and pure. Every day I woke up at 5 and I ran around all of Tono, where the volunteer center was located. I didn't want to miss a thing. I saw the older couples having a morning walk together on a dirt path. I saw the fisherman catching his catch so early in the morning. I saw a baseball team practicing at 6 a.m. I saw the rich green mountains. I saw the shopkeepers opening up their stores. I saw the sushi restaurant open up at 6:30 in the morning, and yes, I had sushi for breakfast. I was going to miss this. I felt a pang in my chest, and my lungs wrenched together slightly, but I had to go home. Arriving home, most people asked me how it was, and then asked, "What souvenirs did you bring home?" A very typical American-minded question, but it is okay. I replied that I bought nothing. Most people were astounded I went to Asia and did not buy a single thing. This question brought me back to my last day when I arrived back into Tokyo from Tono. I could not stand Tokyo. I toured around the city, saw the Tokyo Tower and the shrine and the palace and Harajuku Street, but to be honest, I felt silly and had no inclination to buy anything. How could I? I looked around Tokyo and was confused. This is not what I found just a day ago. This is not the loving, pure society I have been surrounded in. Now I only saw corruption. It's a lie to say that I did not bring anything back to America from Japan. On one of my work days, when I found numerous objects stuck in the dirt, I found a marble. It was very dirty, but I can make out that it was blue and seemed pretty, so I kept it. At that moment, I casually took a water break and walked over to my bag and put it in the front pocket. When I got back to the volunteer center, I removed the marble and took it to the sink to wash off the caked dirt. The blue was beautiful. Worried that I was going to lose my precious item, I continually checked the front part of my bag to make sure it was still there. I even kept checking the pocket on my 15-hour flight back home. When I got back, I placed the marble on my dresser, and it is still there today. It serves as a reminder to me not to forget, not to fall into the tendency of out of sight, out of mind. Every day, I look at that marble, and I remember what I experienced and learned, what people do for one another, how together our strength can heal, how relationships prevail among anything materialistic. Sometimes, I do admit, I worry that it was not my place to take the marble. I am sorry if it was not. Other times, I imagine the owner of that marble. In that particular compound, I found a lot of marbles and dug up a Winnie the Pooh toy. I imagine that the marbles belonged to a little boy who kept them in a cloth sack like the lost boy in Peter Pan. I do not know what happened to this kid. I do not know his specific story, and I am sorry to him if he wished that I did not take one of his marbles. I cannot change my actions now, but he should know because of that marble, I will not forget. I will not forget him and his story. I hope somehow he can feel in his body that someone remembers him wherever he may be. I want him to know that I will share his story. I want him to know that the marbles, like the volunteer center's candles, they symbolize that we have not forgotten. We will remember, and we will spread this story, and we will stand together as a community and support one another. I will not forget the decimated school I walked through. I will not forget the old woman who clutched my hand and did not want to let go. I won't forget the red X's that marked the buildings. Little boy, I will remember you. I will share your story, and I will never forget. Thank you.